What to make of Donald Trump's aborted deal of the century for Afghanistan? The whole region's scrambling after a stunning 11th hour cancellation of a secret summit at the U.S. president's official country retreat, Camp David. The whole region, along with policymakers and watchers in Washington, as they try to make sense of a bid to bring together a weak Afghan president who's up for re-election, a Taliban insurgency that's never stopped fighting, all under the auspices of a U.S. administration intent first and foremost on drawing down an 18-year presence there. Who to fill the void and prevent a final drawdown of U.S. troops from resulting in more bloodshed, a possible even partition of the country, or a return to Taliban rule. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Trump's aborted peace plan. Joining us from Kabul, journalist Bilal Sarwari. Many thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
From Tampa, Florida, Jonathan Schroden. He's the research program director for security consultants CNA. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
From London, Canadian journalist Graham Smith is consultant for International Crisis Group. He's the author of The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And Leela Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, NATO has reacted now, caught out perhaps, but nonetheless insisting its mission in Afghanistan remains unchanged after a weekend of high drama. Catherine Bennett has more.
The Taliban has said that more Americans will die as a result of US President Donald Trump's abrupt decision to cancel peace talks with Taliban and Afghan leaders. Trump announced the meeting on Twitter and then cancelled it just as quickly.
Unbeknownst to almost everyone, the major Taliban leaders and, separately, the president of Afghanistan were going to secretly meet with me at Camp David on Sunday. Unfortunately, in order to build false leverage, they admitted to an attack in Kabul that killed one of our great soldiers and 11 other people. I immediately cancelled the meeting and called off peace negotiations.
Trump's sudden volte-face came just as negotiators were on the brink of a deal. The attack that prompted Trump's change of heart took place on September the 5th, when a car bomb near the US embassy in Kabul killed 10 civilians and a Romanian service member, in addition to the US soldier. The US has recalled its special envoy for Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad. In an interview with NBC, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that for now, talks were dead. But he hoped that they could be revived once the Taliban offered a significant commitment.
We're not going to withdraw our forces without making sure we achieve President Trump's twin objectives. Any reduction in our forces will be based on actual conditions, not commitments, but actual conditions on the ground.
It is unclear whether Trump will go ahead with a planned withdrawal of 5,000 troops in 2020. There are currently 14,000 US soldiers and thousands of other NATO forces stationed in the country, 18 years after the US-led invasion.
Jonathan Schroden, why did he cancel that Camp David summit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. His ostensible reason that he gave in the tweets was because the Taliban have not agreed to reduce violence in the run-up to what would be the start of intra-Afghan negotiations once a U.S. Taliban deal is finalized. So if you take the president at his word, at face value with what his tweet said, it seems that he is looking to try and reduce the level of violence, and he was unsatisfied with the terms of the ceasefire conditions in the existing draft agreement.
But there have been other U.S. servicemen killed since the start of the year. I think there's been 4 in the last 3 weeks. This wasn't anything, excuse me for being callous about it, out of the ordinary almost.
Yeah, it's true that violence has really ratcheted up over the course of the last year, really, if not slightly more than that. But that's true on both sides. I mean, the U.S. has also ramped up its efforts against the Taliban in what they call a military pressure campaign. Again, if I were looking at sort of the last week or so and what happened, the level of violence, I think, did escalate even beyond sort of the new normal, if you will, in so much as within the last 10 days, you've had the Taliban attacking 3 provincial capitals. conducting, a heinous suicide bomb attack against the Green Village in Kabul that that injured well over 100 civilians. There was another car bomb attack that occurred near Logar that got less news coverage, but injured pretty significantly 9 U.S. Special Forces members, and all of that in addition to the car bomb that killed the U.S. service member that you mentioned. So, yes, the level of violence in Afghanistan is high and has been sort of steadily increasing over the last year or so. But even within the last 10 days, I think the Taliban ratcheted things up another level.
Leila Jacinto, that ratcheting up is what we've seen in conflicts all over the world. You're jockeying for position just before you sit down to the bargaining table. How do you explain this 11th hour cancellation of that Camp David summit?
Well, the New York Times did a report, and according to the Times, Trump's advisors were basically split by, there was John Bolton, the national security advisor, who was advising against this deal on one side, and there was U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan, who were pushing for this, which would lead to a U.S. troop drawdown. And apparently, the Bolton argument won. However, this is a lot of inside the beltway analysis of what's going on the ground, which tends to happen when the U.S. conducts its military campaigns. It's always, what's happening in Washington, who has the ear of the president. What also significantly happened was that a number of former U.S. ambassadors to Afghanistan actually wrote an open letter cautioning against this deal. So, so the September 5th attack was...
So Donald Trump was listening to those former ambassadors?
Right. And the slow build-up, actually, of all the words of caution, of all the advice of caution, actually caught up with Trump. Now, all I could say, because I am not in Trump's head, is, he dangled this Camp David carrot because he wanted some, grand gesture. And then ultimately, he just listened to the council drawing him away from this. That's really, as far as I can see, what was happening in D.C.
Graham Smith, we're a little confused, especially because the manner clouds the issue. Saturday night tweets, one that broadcast to the whole world that Afghanistan's incumbent president, who's running for re-election at the end of the month, was among those due at Camp David.
Yeah, using tweets to spill out your secret diplomatic strategy isn't exactly standard best practice. And frankly, the word that I'm getting from my colleagues in Afghanistan today and yesterday is that Trump was not fully honest, shall we say, that essentially the real reason why the Camp David summit did not occur was that the Taliban were not very interested in going to the United States and having their arms twisted at the last minute to get a better deal, when they were perfectly satisfied with the deal that was on the table, that they were ready to sign in Doha.
And that deal was more favorable to them because...
Well, we don't know what was in the deal because both the Taliban and the United States have been pretty careful so far not to spill out all the details. But what we understand is that over the course of about a year and a half, during a period of slow U.S. troop withdrawals, the Taliban were meant to do two things that they said that they would never do. That is to negotiate directly with the Afghan government, which they had never recognized in the past. They called it a puppet regime. And they were going to negotiate the political future of Afghanistan while U.S. boots are still on Afghan soil, which is the second thing that they had promised that they would never, ever do. And so both of those things are pretty significant concessions for the Taliban. And I think in exchange, what they wanted in Doha was some sort of big gathering. They wanted ambassadors from around the world to come and to their own location, to Doha. And they did not want to do this in the United States with President Trump looking on.
All right, so Bilal Sawari, you've heard Leila Jacinto say it was Trump finally listening to his advisors, perhaps. You heard Graham Smith saying that it's a case of the Taliban getting cold feet. What are you hearing?
Well, I think it's important to mention that these were talks between the Americans and the Taliban behind closed doors. The details of these conversations are really not, something that most Afghan politicians and even government officials know. I mean, we saw Zalmay Khalilzad negotiating, which was something that the Afghan government was not very happy about his way of conducting these negotiations. And as we have seen over the last 11 months or so, all sides are fighting for leverage. The American military, the American air power is helping the Afghan government in places like Kunduz and elsewhere. So this is very much a fight for leverage. However, what I can tell you from my own travels to places like Uruzgan, where I've met fathers who had lost 3 sons, for example, 7 years ago in an IED attack on the second day of Eid, or the father of a policeman who was killed the night before his wedding, they all said that we need a comprehensive ceasefire, that we really need peace more than anything else. But I think the irony was that when you had some of those, discussions between Taliban and some Afghan politicians and perhaps some government officials at the highest echelons of President Ghani's government in their own personal capacity, that veto power, I think, was with foreign envoys. And the Taliban really had a bigger say in who could attend and who could not. And one thing you really saw, tragically, I should say, the victims of this conflict were not there at that table. So I think the country here really lacks, consensus among Afghan government and officials, but there's also lack of a national peace strategy. And I think until that does not happen, you will continue to see a road full of challenges. But no doubt, the country needs respite from violence. I think there's no military solution to this conflict. The people of Afghanistan cannot take this conflict, not a single day.
And what about Ashraf Ghani, the president who, as you just pointed out, left out of the negotiations? And then it's Donald Trump announcing that he was going to show up at Camp David.
Well, I think what people need to really understand that we, as a country and as people, I think do come from a very painful past that was not long ago. When the West abandoned Afghanistan, the Soviets left and there was a civil war. So I think those painful memories are alive. And I think it's also the greatest misunderstanding of the Afghan psyche in this conflict. If you really remove the support that the Pakistani army and intelligence services have been given to the Taliban over the years, especially the Haqqani network and others, that is not to say that Taliban are not an Afghan reality, that Taliban are not Afghans, and that they should not have a share in power and in future government. So I think there's a lot of mistrust. From what I can tell you here, even people like the former president, Hamid Karzai, who was a staunch supporter of Ambassador Khalilzad's efforts, came out publicly castigating what he called a peace process that was controlled by foreigners. So there was a lot of secrecy and there was a lot of games being played behind the doors. And I hope everyone can learn a lesson from now on. And I hope for Afghanistan's sake that these doors for negotiations are opened quite soon, because that mistake was made in the earlier years when negotiations with the Taliban were refused. And look where we are today as a country. It's the most dangerous country perhaps here in this region. Bombs are going off, there are night raids, there are airstrikes, and the people of Afghanistan can really not afford a single coffin. They are really falling like a thunder on this society.
Well, Jonathan Troden, you agree that if you want to do it again, you cannot have any more just the Taliban and the U.S. in the room?
Well, I think the structure of the talks has always been to get the U.S. and the Taliban to agree to a certain set of conditions that would then lead to the Taliban agreeing to sit down formally with the Afghan government. I don't think the structure of the talks will change based on what happened over the last weekend. I think the Taliban will insist on still having that agreement be reached with the U.S. before they will sit down with the Afghan government.
But how much does that undermine the Afghan government?
Well, I think, it sort of cuts two ways, right? I mean, if the summit had actually taken place, I would argue that would have undermined the Afghan government position quite a bit by elevating the Taliban, which is a non-state group of only about 50 to 70,000 members, to the level of the most powerful man in the country, and putting them on par at Camp David with the duly elected government of Afghanistan. So I think that would have been quite detrimental to Ashraf Ghani's negotiating position had it actually taken place. Now that it didn't, that they canceled it, I think Ghani actually comes out of this looking fairly well, at least in so much as he was willing to, at more or less a moment's notice, get on a plane and travel to the United States with very few details and a very loosely described structure of what was going to happen, in order to try and bring some semblance of peace to his country. So I think you really have to give him a lot of credit for being willing to engage in what was clearly a very nebulous and ill-formed, summit idea to sit down with the Taliban and Donald Trump personally.
Graham Smith, again, it brings us back to why if it is nebulous as has just been described by Jonathan Schroden, why have this take place so soon? Why now?
I mean, trying to negotiate peace now is always going to be better than trying to negotiate peace later. For the primary reason that my friend Bilal in Kabul just told you, that the people of Afghanistan are suffering. The war in Afghanistan has more battle deaths than any other conflict on the planet Earth right now. It's significantly bloodier than the wars in Syria, Yemen, Iraq. This cannot go on. But also, if you are the United States and the Afghan government, it's probably a good idea to negotiate sooner rather than later, because the Afghan government is losing territory every single day. And so the kind of deal that we could have cut 10 years ago would have been significantly better than the kind of deal we could have cut today. And if there is some sort of significant delay now in the diplomatic process, say this pushes us back by several months or even a year, then the sort of situation in which the diplomats will be negotiating could be substantially worse. And that is not great for the Afghan government's bargaining position.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
France 24, c'est la richesse de la diversité culturelle mondiale, avec un réseau de correspondants à travers la planète.
En France 24 en español comunicamos a Latinoamérica con el mundo entero.
روح مهنية شعارها واحد، حرية التعبير. هذه هي بصمة France 24.
Africa on France 24 is about its people and their stories.
Los ciudadanos nos cuentan cuáles son las iniciativas y las problemáticas que tienen en sus comunidades a través del programa Los Observadores. Eso los acerca aún más a France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. One last long shot attempt by Boris Johnson to get the House of Commons to approve an early general election before he suspends Parliament immediately thereafter. Speaker John Bercow opens the day by announcing he'll be stepping down. Nearly all flights grounded in the first pilot strike in the history of British Airways. They've walked off the job for 48 hours over pay. Yuka Huai will have all the day's business. Too soon to lift sanctions, but France's foreign and defense ministers in Moscow call for a warming of ties as they hail a weekend prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. Future revelations won't come from me, says Eric Snowden from his exile in Moscow. The NSA whistleblower sits down with France 24, explains why the danger now comes from the private sector, most notably Google and Facebook. That interview on our website, france24.com. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering where to next after that aborted Afghanistan peace summit that was to take place at Camp David, the U.S. president's retreat outside of Washington, D.C. With us from Kabul, journalist Bilal Sarawi. Welcome back to Jonathan Schroden, who's in Tampa, Florida, Research Program Director for Security Consultants, CNA. From London, journalist Graham Smith, consultant for International Crisis Group, and France24.com's Leila Jacinto. This Monday, by the way, happens to be the 18th anniversary of the assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud by al-Qaeda operatives, timed prelude to the September 11th attacks. The leader of the Northern Alliance was one of the very few consensual figures among those fighting the Taliban. Now, the number 2 of the country's ruling executive council, who himself is a candidate at the next presidential election, Abdullah, marking the day on Twitter on the streets of Kabul, citizens shrugged. On the streets of Kabul, though, you didn't see many people, and that is because, maybe you can explain this to us, Bilal Sarawi. Every year, the commemoration of Massoud's death is a dangerous event, it seems.
Well, what we experience every year is the power projection by some politicians, and we see not supporters, I would call them really thugs, with weapons, shooting live bullets in a city of at least 6 million people, and carrying knives. This is not one group. I think many groups do it, and it's become sort of the habit, that people of this country, I think, also tolerate. Today, what was quite tragic, I must say, that one Afghan soldier from the Kabul garrison was killed by these guys who had lost a son in the Afghan National Security Forces. So the culture of impunity is prevalent. Then you had Afghanistan's best special forces trained to fight these complex attacks, on the street, trying to control that situation. So I don't think it's only the Taliban or the Islamic State. This country really has some major issues that it needs to sort out. I think as a nation, as people, Afghanistan is really failing on those fronts. But I was also speaking to a friend just before I came to speak to you, that a very powerful doctor was assassinated in the eastern city of Jalalabad. This is a guy who had been calling for better security in Jalalabad after a string of assassinations targeting doctors in that city. So I think Afghanistan is really struggling on many different fronts. There are many different challenges. Everyday life is fraught with massive amount of incompetency when you talk about government. Then take, for example, raids by CIA-backed Afghan units killing 4 brothers in that city. And I think all in all, I can tell you, speaking to many Afghans from different provinces in the last 5 weeks, including my own province of Kunar, everyone wants a comprehensive ceasefire. I think there's a lot of support, but it is now up to the Afghan government, up to the Afghan politicians, the Americans and the Taliban and others, especially Afghanistan's friends, to come up with a strategy that works. Remember something, the risk of Afghan National Security Forces breaking down is real. I've spoken to many Afghan commanders who have said, why should I be fighting on the front lines when the Americans and the Taliban have a deal? What do I do when I go back to my village? I have to buy that local insurance because the Taliban commander would be someone from that tribe. After all, they're people from those villages. So it's not an easy situation. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for the Afghan government, for President Ghani, although I have got no sympathy for Abdullah and President Ghani fighting over power between each other, which has been, I think, a very prevalent feature of this government that was installed by the Americans after the fraudulent elections that we had. But I feel extremely heartbroken on a daily basis the amount of Afghans getting killed, including Taliban. Because in Uruzgan, I met the father of a Talib who had 2 widows. 2 of his sons had been killed. One was a Talib, the other was taken and tortured and killed by government forces. So you really have to put those lives and the sufferings of ordinary Afghans into this process. That's now, all about foreign envoys and about Taliban sitting and the government officials not sitting. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about ordinary Afghans, as it should be.
Or ordinary Afghans, as it should be, and citizens on the streets of Kabul. They shrugged at the motive for pulling the pulling of these talks, that killing of a U.S. Army sergeant, feeling, they say, ignored.
Because one of their soldiers, presumably their general, was killed in a suicide attack at Abdul Haq Square, Trump called off the peace talks. So many Afghan army forces and civilians are killed on a daily basis, but they don't care about that.
It's good that the talks have been cancelled. There should be intra-Afghan talks. People should be involved in them, and they should be informed about them.
Jonathan Troden, your thoughts on what happens next and who can do what Bilal so desperately wants, which is something comprehensive where there really is a breakthrough.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I completely agree with Bilal and others who have said that a ceasefire is, needed for the Afghan people. I mean, they are suffering terribly, and a ceasefire would greatly, reduce that suffering. However, though, I just don't see it as something that's going to happen anytime soon. I mean, when I look at the structure of these talks and, where the sides come together, I just do not see the Taliban agreeing to any type of comprehensive ceasefire while they're negotiating with either the U.S. or the Afghan government. And I say that simply because they are not a widespread popular movement inside Afghanistan. They are largely unpopular insurgent group. And the use of violence, the ability to attack into Afghanistan's cities from the rural areas that the Taliban control is a primary, if not the primary, mode of leverage that they have in any type of negotiation. And so for them to give that up, I just see as fairly anathema to what it is they're trying to do here via these negotiations, which is to arrive at some type of position that's on terms that are favorable to them.
And do they smell blood here? That the U.S. government's real end game is pulling its troops out. It's not formulating a peace deal.
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people say that, and certainly Trump talks a lot about his desire to get the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. But it's worth recognizing that President Obama, in the latter years of his presidency, spoke much the same language. I mean, he had a very strong desire to get the U.S. troops out and had announced a timetable to do that, and tried to do that. And yet he was faced with, essentially the same structural conditions that Trump faces now, which prevented him from ultimately withdrawing all of the U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And I think Trump is staring at the same problem, which is to say he may pull out the 5,000 or so troops that he authorized to go in when he became president in order to try and offer his political base some semblance of progress on that front ahead of the U.S. presidential election. But the remaining, 8,500 or 9,000 troops or so, a good chunk of which are there for the counterterrorism mission against the likes of ISIS, I don't think he's going to withdraw them anytime soon for the simple fact that ISIS is there, they're gaining in strength. The Taliban is there, they're gaining in strength. Al-Qaeda is still there with a presence. And for him to withdraw and open up the possibility of Afghanistan turning into what Iraq was for the Obama presidency, I just don't see him doing that and taking that risk to his personal legacy as president.
Graham Smith, you agree?
Not with all of it, I'll be honest, although I hugely respect our fellow guests. I'm not convinced that Al-Qaeda is a significant force on the battlefield in Afghanistan. Our friend Bilal in Kabul is originally from Kunar province, the rugged eastern mountains where Al-Qaeda is sometimes reported to be hanging out. But Bilal, I'm willing to bet that you've never seen an Arab walking the streets in Kunar since 2001. I mean, the fact is that the threat of so-called international terrorists is often significantly exaggerated in Afghanistan. Nearly all of the violence is between two sides. It's between the Taliban and the pro-government forces. About 2% of the incidents can be attributed to foreign fighters of one kind or another. You have some small Uzbek militant groups, a few Uyghurs running around, but really it's primarily Taliban versus government. And if you want to end the war, that's a place to focus, I think. And ultimately, we will have to get back to these peace talks. It could happen in a matter of days, or we could be talking about months or years. It's really unknown at this point. I do know that in Doha, Taliban negotiators are sitting around sort of waiting for the phone to ring. I mean, they have been pretty moderate in their response to the events of this weekend. We have not so far seen the sort of spike in violence that everyone was fearing as a result of Trump's tweets. And so we're sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. We don't know yet whether peace talks could resume with the Taliban.
Leela Jacinto, I want to add another wrinkle to all this. Theoretically, there's a presidential election. I say theoretically because I'm not sure it's happening, but a presidential election in Afghanistan at the end of the month. And again, it brings us back to what we were discussing in part one, the role of Ashraf Ghani. We talked about it, out in the cold when those bilateral negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban begin. Back in April, May, he stages what's called a Loya Jirga, which is these consultations, grand assemblies of different tribal leaders, of elders. Is he in the game?
I think he does come out stronger with the latest Trump pullout. I mean, we are approaching the 18th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And over 18 years, if you really go to see the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan, this superpower has had a consistent problem of having faith and empowering the democratic structures and the democratically elected leaders that come out of Afghanistan. And, they come out from, violent elections or potentially flawed elections. But there is always an undermining by U.S. officials of elected Afghan governments.
But you remember last time, Leela, there was that protracted post-electoral dispute between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. Can Afghanistan afford the same thing this time around?
Well, I mean, Afghanistan has had power changes by the bullets. And so far, when Karzai gave up power, it was really the first time that, a ballot brought about a change in power. I think what the problem is that the U.S., many mistakes were made in the course of, 18 years. But the problem is within the U.S. too, there is a sense that, we throw billions of dollars at this problem and we're going to get it completely solved. Then impatience sets in, and then, whoever's in the ARG presidential palace gets sidelined. Zalmay Khalilzad, who is, has a track record, he used to be called the Viceroy of Kabul when he was the U.S. ambassador in Kabul. And there's a steady undermining of Afghan elected officials. Zalmay Khalilzad actually called for an interim, a transitional government, instead of having presidential elections, which have already been postponed twice. So the presidential elections were set for September 28th. Now, if this Camp David deal did go through, and there was some sort of grand announcement over the weekend, that would have seriously undermined Ashraf Ghani, because he would have a few weeks to go into a presidential election. And Afghans are getting increasingly worried about this deal that does not have any of their elected representatives, do not include victims. The Taliban comes out of this stronger. They have engaged with diplomats in Qatar. They have dined with, they have got this stature that, Afghans are just watching aghast at what's happening.
Bilal Sarari, pick your druthers. Would you rather continue to have a head of state whose mandate has expired, although it's been rolled over a little bit by the courts, or going to the polls with all of that which that entails?
I think it's a question for the Afghan people, but if you ask me as an Afghan, as a citizen, not as a journalist, I would definitely say we really need to stop the bloodshed, because what happens in 5 years' time, we'll have a generation of widows and orphans in a country that's already crippled by 4 decades of war. I mean, I really feel sorry for the father or a widow of a Taliban in Uruzgan or in Helmand, because that is the weight that falls on our society, and we'll have to deal with that. And the same goes for soldiers and civilians. I'm speaking purely from a humanitarian point of view. So I think Afghanistan needs an end to this bloodshed. The country is really bleeding. And I mean, what we don't often speak about, how can entire families vanish? How can entire families be killed by all sides? Let's take the example of the 4 brothers that were killed. They were accused of financing the Islamic State. Well, even if that was the case, these CIA-backed Afghan units went and murdered these 4 brothers, 2 of whom were working for the government. I knew all of them actually personally. So as you know, as relatives, as friends, this is quite difficult to process. I mean, people really need to realize that this tragedy is breaking hearts and it's destroying communities and societies. But again, on that, there is no consensus. You have to be quite honest that all sides are really jockeying for power, for positions. And as I told you, for me as an Afghan who have covered this conflict for almost 18 years, it was heartbreaking to not even see a single victim of all sides have a seat at that table. At the end of the day, it's about the fate of
Bilal,
those people,
in the
not
context,
some of us here in Kabul.
In the context that you describe, should the country be going to elections at the end of the month?
Well, looking at the current security issues, looking at the fatigue that people have with politicians and what happened after 2014, the threat that the Taliban have issued, the political instability that there is, I think the country should really prioritize peace. But if that does not happen, then Afghanistan, I think, should have a fairer election. And I also think the international community is not innocent in this. They have always accepted quite a fair amount of fraud and over the last, let's say, 18 years or so. And we have just gone ahead with that. So I think some of those mistakes needs to be corrected. And let's wait and see. I don't think anyone can predict. Let's wait and see if the people of Afghanistan will be willing to go out and take all these risks and elect a new president. That can be anyone. Obviously, President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, the 2 main and leading candidates, are incumbents. The state resources are there. You know, I will not go into those details. But once more, what I cover and what I get disappointed with every morning and every night when I go to bed is the tragic, you know, incidents killing Afghans. And there's that culture of impunity. No one is being held accountable. And as I'm speaking to you this morning, when the district of Khwajagar was attacked by the Taliban in the northeastern province of Takhar, I spoke to a father who had lost 2 kids this morning, and there are no names for victims anymore. I mean, we are only looking at these incidents and numbers, and unfortunately, the country is getting used to these incidents as an accepted fact of life. And why should that be happening in 21st century? Why should there not be a better plan implementable by everyone? Why should Afghans not be able to go on ahead and carry on with their normal lives?
With their normal lives. We're almost out of time. Jonathan Schroden, how much will Afghanistan be an issue on the 2020 U.S. presidential election campaign trail?
Quite frankly, I don't think it will be a very large issue. You know, in the 2016 election, it was barely mentioned by either side. I think if Trump does pull out a number of troops, the 5,000 or so that he's rumored to want to pull out ahead of the election, it'll give him a talking point that might resonate with his base. But there seems to be broad, actual bipartisan consensus that the U.S. needs to find a way to get out of Afghanistan. And so as a point of debate between the 2 sides, I don't think they're actually that far apart. And so I wouldn't expect it to play very heavily in the U.S. election this fall.
Graham Smith, you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think that both the Republicans and the Democrats want to get out of Afghanistan. That's not going to change. What really scares me is that, this stumble right on the 5-yard line, as it were, right on the brink of these historic peace talks, might mean that, the inferno of violence continues. And, 2019 could set a new record as the most violent year in Afghanistan's history for the last 40 years.
Eva Jacinto?
Will it be an issue in the U.S. elections? No, I agree with everybody. But in terms of insecurity, I think the only way forward is to strengthen the hand of the Afghan administrations, because ultimately it's the Afghan security forces who have to maintain order. And by that, I mean police forces, army services, and, these mixed messaging that came out of these current negotiations, which is, giving the Taliban the upper hand in these discussions, sent messages to Afghans who, should have been joining the army, should have put their security in the hands of the security services. It threw everything for a toss. So I think we could, restart and press reset now.
All right. Many thanks, Eva Jacinto. I want to thank Bilal Sarari in Kabul, Jonathan Trud for being with us from Tampa, Florida, as well as Graham Smith in London. Stay with us. It's time now for Media Watch.